Well, we are in the middle of a 3-week series, very important series, where we are talking about what the village is all about, why we are here. We introduced our vision statement last week, an important statement. You might remember it, the village, touching our world with faith, hope, and love. Do you remember that? Say it with me, the village, touching our world with faith, hope, and love. Remember we said that a vision statement needed to be easy to remember? We talked about some vision statements that we've had at the village in the past where you had to have a PhD or close to a PhD to be able to remember all of the words we tried to pack into a vision statement. And we said, no more. We're going to make it simple and easy and everybody's going to know it. The village, touching our world with faith, hope, and love. And we said we got that from 1 Corinthians 13:13. You know the verse on the screen. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. And next week we're going to talk about the greatest of these is love. And so you be here. Make sure you're part of our service. And it's the end of daylight savings time, so you'll get a whole extra hour of sleep. And so that means you don't have to get here at 11:30. You can get here at 10:30, right? Some of y'all come in pretty late. You don't even know we have a service before the preacher gets up here, but we do. And we urge you next week, be here early, bring your friends as we talk about love. Well, last week, Jeff taught us about faith and how faith was a part of our mission statement of the church, and it was fantastic. I've heard people talking about it all week. He talked about there being both a vertical and horizontal element to faith. And he talked about the fact that the vertical part is how we relate to God as our creator, how we put our trust in Christ as the one who gives us access to the Father. It's beautiful. He talked about the vertical, but he also talked about the horizontal aspects. And this is what I've heard many of you talking about this week, that if we have faith, it affects how we think. If we have faith, it should affect how we act. And if we have faith, it should affect how we speak. And I've loved hearing people say, you know, we've been talking about, does our speech give us away as a follower of Christ, or is our speech faithless? So that was last week. It was fabulous. If you missed it, go online and to look at it. It's very, very important for you to see. But today we're going to talk about that second word in our mission statement, the village, touching our world with faith, hope, and love. But before we get into what hope is, I want to talk to you just a few minutes about what it feels like to be hopeless. And I bet many of you can relate to this. Probably all of us can at some point in our lives. They say that a human can go weeks without eating food. Some of us can go longer than that, I believe. And we have storage, we could go a long, long time. But that we can go just days without drinking water. We can go minutes without breathing air. But it's hard to live even a few seconds when you have no hope, when life feels for you hopeless. Now, what I wanted to do right off the bat is just talk to you about kind of where I see hopelessness in people. And I have lived these. I know what it feels like to be hopeless. Then I want us to talk about what Christ has given us, the ability to have hope, and then how we're able to share that hope with a world that desperately needs it. So pen in hand, let's jot down a few, actually 10 causes of hopelessness. And think about where you are right now, because some of you maybe haven't put it into these words, but you're going to say, you know what? I am feeling a sense of hopelessness this morning. I am feeling a sense of despair this morning. 10 quick things. When you feel alone or when you feel abandoned. Jeff and I have talked about this. There have been times when I have been in a crowd of people and felt so alone. You ever been like that? You just felt alone or abandoned. You can have all the people around you in the world. It doesn't matter if you're hopeless. You don't feel that. Or this one, when life seems out of control. Anybody there? You don't have to raise your hand. But you know that feeling when life seems out of control. There's a sense of hopelessness. You begin to say things like this: it's never going to change. It's never going to change. This is just how it is. This is where I am. This is just the way life is going to be. And you just find yourself deeper and deeper and deeper in despair. or lacking purpose. That's been a cause of hopelessness for many, many people when they look at their life and they say, there's no purpose here. I'm just going through the same thing every day. There's nothing new. There's nothing under the sun different. I'm just going through the same patterns every single day. How about this one? Grieving a loss. That certainly is a huge impetus to hopelessness. When you've had a major loss or a series of major losses in your life that cause that sense of hopelessness within you. You ever felt inadequate? Not up to the challenge? Too weak to actually make it through? And as you look at yourself in the mirror, you think, this is a sense of hopelessness I feel. I'm always a day late, a dollar short, it seems. I'm never going to get on top of the situation. Or how about this? Guilt. Boy, I've been there. Anybody else relate to that? You do something that's just terribly disappointing to you, to your family, to the people who love you, and you just feel the guilt. And even though God is forgiven, God is wanting you to move forward, God is wanting you to learn from your mistakes and take steps forward, you can't shake it. You just feel guilt. You feel so burdened down. How about when you've been deeply wounded by somebody? Anybody here ever experienced that? They were my friend. They were my friend. We loved each other. We were going to make it to the end through thick or thin. That was who we were. But then they wound you. Or when you're pulled in the wrong direction, temptation can be a cause of hopelessness when you feel like, I just keep getting pulled down this path, and this path is killing me. I keep making the same stupid decision every single day, and as I make that same decision, I'm getting those same stinking results every single day, and I just have a sense of hopelessness. Or maybe when you realize you are traumatized by fear. I've had many people who've talked to me about the fact that fear seems to have an unnatural grip on them. Fear can be your friend. All fear is not bad. Fear can be a good thing, but an unnatural fear that traumatizes you in every way can cause you to feel hopeless. And then when you have that sense that defeat is inevitable, you're not going to be able to win. You're going to go out in a defeated posture. That's your life. That gives you a sense of hopelessness. You know, I started out as a young pastor. I started way too young, way too young. By that I mean I wish I'd had some older people who had said, you know what, you might want to live life a little bit and learn a few things before you stand up in front of people and talk to them. But that wasn't the way it worked. And so at 24 years old, I go through a major breakup, largely my fault, and a sense of disappointment. I pastored 3 churches. I had somewhat of a reputation as a good person. But suddenly I was feeling so hopeless. And no longer was I the pastor. Now I was going to be sitting in the chair where you sit. I've been a pastor since I was 19. Been a church leader since I was 15. Up on the platform all those years. But now I'm just sitting in the congregation. Maybe the church could help me in my hopelessness. So I'd get up every Sunday morning. My little boys were 5 and 2. I'd wash their face and feed them their breakfast and take them to church. And I'd sit down, so hopeless. Certainly there's got to be an answer. Certainly there's got to be some help. Certainly somebody's got to help me get out of this funk that I'm in. I am dying. And what I discovered was the churches I was going to didn't seem to think hope was such a big deal because I never felt like I received it there. There were other things that I picked up were a big deal. I went to a church and I found out that they were first place in the last 13 years in softball. They had won every pretty good rate. I mean, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. And they had done great. Every year they would recruit the best players. They didn't have to come to the church, but they'd put on the church jersey. They'd go out and they'd kick everybody else's tail. And they were so proud. And they had a trophy case and they had trophies. And they were proud of that. But I didn't sense any hope there. That didn't feel like the purpose of the church. I was dying. I was ashamed. I was depressed. I was in despair, and it was at my own hand. And I couldn't get out of it. I went to churches, and they were so proud of their choir. And their choirs were great. I mean, if you just wanted to listen to beautiful music, these churches were incredible, professional. But I would sit there and I would listen. And I would leave and say, that was beautiful, but I don't have any hope. I went to churches that prided themselves on their political activism. I mean, they had flags, American flag, right beside the Christian flag. Like, where's their allegiance? Both, America and the God. Preachers would talk about their Jesus First lapel pin, and they would blast the opposition party. There was no question if you were in this church who you were going to vote for. No question at all. I remember going to a service. In fact, Jane and I went to a mega church several years ago to hear a very famous preacher. And he preached for 90 minutes on Islamic fascism and how our country wasn't doing enough and that the Muslims were taking over the world. And I sat there and I listened. And then they closed, and he sold $1 million worth of books and tapes. I'm telling you, he sold a lot of books and tapes. But there was no hope. It seemed to me like it was a big scare job. It seemed like it got people all worked up, but it didn't sound like Jesus. Philip Yancey, one of my favorite writers, wrote a book, What's So Amazing About Grace. You want to read a great book. It's weighty, a little bit weighty, but it's beautifully written. What's So Amazing About Grace? He talked about a friend of his who met a prostitute who was a drug addict who had gotten so lost in her addiction that she actually was tricking out her daughter, her child daughter, to make money so she could buy drugs. And the man said to her, have you thought about going to church? And she said, why would I go there? I already feel bad enough as it is. Hopelessness. I've been in churches when I was in my despair, when I was hopeless, that seemed to put all of their pride in their building. And they were beautiful buildings. And they had the latest technology. And we like technology, and that's a good thing. And they had all the tricks. And they were so proud about it. And you were just kind of mesmerized. It was like being at Disneyland or Disney World. You just kind of looked and said, this is amazing. And nothing wrong with that. But that seemed to be what it was about. And not about offering people hope. During that period of my life, this is when I didn't know God would ever use me again, y'all. I was seriously lost. I was a lost, pitiful guy. And I read about a pastor. I didn't really know much about him because in my Baptist background, we didn't study. If you weren't Baptist, then you were going to hell to us. We didn't really care what you thought. But then when I kind of was going through my lost time, I was reading people that weren't Baptist, and I read a guy named Chuck Smith. He's just died a few years ago, but you ever want to read about somebody that's just an amazing man? He started the church movement called Calvary Chapel. Much of what we know as contemporary Christian music was born out of Calvary Chapel. It's a great church, Costa Mesa, California. But anyway, what happened, this is in the 60s, early 70s, hippies, the long hair, there was a movement of God among that group of people, and it kind of started, at least in our country, it started on the West Coast. And Chuck Smith was kind of the leading guy for that taking place. And so all these hippies who had tried all the stuff, they had tried to, zone out and free love and all that stuff, and they were hopeless. And they're hearing the story of Jesus, and their lives are being changed, and they're beginning to gather together, and it's becoming 50, and then 100, and then 200, and then 500, and 1,000, and they build a building, Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. And it's just this huge warehouse, and the people are coming, and they're giving their lives to Christ, and people's lives are being changed. And then they updated the building, and they put carpet in, and the people kept coming, and they were getting their lives right with God, and people were changing. It was amazing until the day that the chairman of the deacons came to Chuck Smith and said, "We've got a problem." And he said, "We do?" And the man said, "Yes, we do." He said, "All these people are coming in with their flip-flops." And he said, "They're getting sand in the carpet and it's ruining the carpet. Something has to be done." And Chuck Smith said, "I agree with you. Tear out the dang carpet. Tear out the carpet." That's the way we're supposed to be, because he knew what mattered was hope to people, hope to people. Not the beauty of an edifice, hope to the people. So how do we get this hope? What is this hope all about? Well, a couple of observations before I get into the biblical definition of hope. One, when I say hope, I'm not talking about simply optimism. So make sure you get that. We're not talking about simply optimism. Hope and optimism are not the same thing. Hope is, at least as I'm explaining it today, is more theological. Optimism is more psychological. Optimism is telling yourself things are going to be great, even when they're not great. And some people are just naturally optimistic. Jeff and I are opposites. He has said from up here, he said, my first thought normally is a pessimistic, negative thought, and I have to move towards optimism. My whole life, it's crazy, but in some of you are this way, I'm just by nature an optimist. So much so that Jane and I heard this story, and it's kind of become a little catchphrase between us of the parents that were so worried because their little boy was so optimistic, and they said, "This is going to get him in trouble as he gets older. We've got to do something." And so they decided for Christmas, they were going to just fill a room filled with horse manure because they needed to get this boy to realize sometime life gives you crap, right? That's what it does. And so they wake up the little boy and they say, "Here's what we've got you." And he goes into this room that is filled with horse manure and he just dives in. Horse manure is flying everywhere. And they said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "As much horse manure as there is in here, there's got to be a pony somewhere. I know there's got to be a pony somewhere." So what happens for Jane and me is often she'll say something that is truthfully bad, disappointing, discouraging, should be something we think about, and I will make my normal optimistic sentence, and she will say, "Where is that pony?" And I'll realize that's what she is talking about. When I'm talking about hope, I'm not talking about that. There's nothing wrong with optimism, by the way. Optimism is a good thing to have. I'm in favor of being an optimist, but hope is different. Biblical hope is different. In Scripture, both the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament, the words translated hope means this. It's an indication of certainty, not an arrogant certainty. It's not like that. It is a quiet certainty or a strong, confident expectation. God has made promises to you. You are knowing His character as you walk with Him. And you know it's so. You know what He has said is going to come to pass. In my life, things might be bad, but I have hope. Because I believe God is growing me up. I believe He is growing me up. He is working in me. And I believe I am becoming the person He has created me to be. I may be facing something overwhelming. Maybe you are today facing something overwhelming. On the surface, it looks insurmountable. I get that. But God has promised me that He will be with me in the valley. Therefore, I will roll out of bed tomorrow and I will face the day because I am not facing it alone. I know the doctor has said there's no hope. My desire, I want to live here longer if I can. And if that's God's plan for me, I will live here longer. But I have a hope that God has a plan for me beyond this life and a place for me beyond this life. Therefore, I will get out of the bed and I will take steps forward because I have hope. Now let me just inject. I was with a sweet lady this week, and she had some thoughts about her own mortality, and it was frightening her because she had always thought, taught, and believed that as Christians, we would never be nervous or afraid. Can I tell you something? That's not so. there is a sense of at times being a little nervous, a little afraid. There are those moments that it takes just a little while to get yourself adjusted to where hope is really the center of what your mind is on. And I told her, I said, what you're feeling is as normal and natural for followers of Christ. Don't you ever think that we have to be perfect in our belief in every way. You're a human and you're feeling what all of us have felt. But what you will find is as you put your trust in God more each day, you're able to get up. The fear begins to decrease. You're able to make it. Hope, hope, hope. Let me give you a verse on hope, because hope is something that's invisible. You can't prove it. It's invisible, and it's kind of in front of you, and you believe it because God has said it so, and God is pulling you towards it, but you can't prove it. You can't wrestle somebody to the ground with it. It's something that's quiet in you. Look at the scripture in Romans 8:24 and 25. Paul writes, for in hope, by the way, hope and faith are very, very almost interchangeable at times. Hope and faith. You have a hope. You put your faith in this thing that you hope for, this thing that you believe, this thing that God has placed in your heart. You put faith in that, but it's very, very similar. For in hope we have been saved, but hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one also hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, with perseverance, we wait eagerly for it. But it's not something you can see. This is something that you just trust in your spirit, something that's so. So in summary, what is hope? Hope is the confident expectation or the sure certainty that what God has promised is true. Now I want you to know something. When this becomes a reality to you, it's not something that is passive. It becomes something that is active in your heart. Hope doesn't make you want to just sit back. Hope makes you want to more aggressively walk in this world, to seize the day. God is on the throne. We don't live in fear. We don't live cowered down. We don't think that this world is too big for us, that we're never going to be able to be victorious. No, we get up. We live the day to its fullest. We look around us for people who are hopeless, and we want to engage them. We want to show them what can be as they come to faith in Christ. It's not passive, it's active. It's dynamic. It's important. Well, how do you get it? I was hoping you'd ask. This is how you get it. Real hope happens when you have a relationship with God through Christ. That's the beginnings. It is the process by which I began to believe God accomplishes what he says he will accomplish. Let me say that again. I hear music playing somewhere. That's all right. Let me read it again. Real hope happens when you have a relationship with God through Jesus. It's the process by which I begin to believe God accomplishes what he says he will accomplish. So it begins with a choice you make, and it grows as you spiritually mature. Again, at 24, I had never been hopeless before. So it took some growth for me to understand, that was available to me when I was hopeless. I just didn't know. And now at 53, I'm learning that things I'm handling now so much better than I handled then because I'm growing, I'm maturing, I'm learning. Now, 2 quick thoughts, and then I got a story to close with. Thought number 1, I need God's hope to live my best life. I need God's hope to live my best life. There's a verse I want you to see, Hebrews 6:19. And by the way, there's hundreds of verses on hope. So boiling it down to a few is kind of difficult. But Hebrews 6:19, we have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. Would you read that scripture with me, please? We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. The writer of Hebrews says hope is an anchor for us. Now, you know why boats and ships use anchors. They use anchors to keep the boat from drifting. They use anchors so in the midst of a storm it will kind of even out and they won't toss and turn so much. Well, the same thing is true for us. God gives us this hope and it keeps us from, 1, drifting. Any of you drift? Sure we do. That's life. Life, the natural tendency in life is to drift. But when you have hope as an anchor, God is working in me. God is growing me up. I am learning each and every day who I am in Him. I am becoming more and more a part of His church. I'm using my gifts and talents in God's church to grow people and help people. As I do that more and more and more, I have less tendencies to drift. But also, when the waves are really tossing to and fro, an anchor will keep a boat from tipping over. And we need that in our lives too. Because life sometimes throws us some really crazy things. And listen, you're not immune if you're a follower of Jesus. You'll have some of the craziest stuff in the world happen. You'll have deaths happen around you. People close to you will die. Why did they die? They shouldn't have died, but they'll die. And life will be spinning out of control, but an anchor doesn't mean it hurts less. It still hurts, but you don't lose your way because there's an anchor for your soul. And just parenthetically, bigger the boat, the bigger the anchor. Some of you pride yourselves on living a big life, and some of you can live a big life. But you're going to need a big anchor. A little anchor is not going to get it. A little anchor is not going to get it. You're going to need a big anchor if you want to survive a big life. And we have some young men and women in our church destined to live big lives. A little anchor won't get it for them. So that's one thing I want to say. I need God's hope to live the best life. You need God's hope to live the best life. And then finally, I want to say this. I need hope as I think about my death. I need hope as I think about my death. Now, I know 100% everybody dies. We don't like to think about it. We don't like to talk about it. And I've told you in the past, I was very afraid of death as a child. And I guess maybe all children are, but it seemed unnatural how afraid I was. Because it just paralyzed me. Nobody's getting out of here alive. We're all going to die. But the more I have opened myself up to God and to hope, I'm realizing the less afraid I am of death. That God, who is real, has promised me life beyond this life. And while I'm not really wanting to leave today, when my time is at hand to leave, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. And you can be ready to go. That's hope. You don't have to be afraid. And again, it's not a boastful thing. It's not an ugly thing. It is just a quiet thought. This is what Paul writes to the Thessalonians. Brothers and sisters, we don't want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind with no hope. I've done hundreds of funerals. Can I tell you something? Those who follow Christ grieve differently than those who have no connection, as far as no spiritual connection at all. They grieve differently because they're hopeless. But you go to a funeral where people, the whole family, they know Christ. They still grieve, but they grieve with hope. This isn't it. There's life beyond this life. We live this life to the fullest, but then there's life beyond this life. And that's an important thing for us to know. Well, the gift of hope is something that can change our lives. If we embrace it as a vision statement in our church, it'll change our church. Because there's hundreds of thousands of people who are hopeless this morning. Within 20 minutes of our church, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are hopeless this morning. And they don't need to go to a church that's pride is in their softball team. They need to find a church somewhere that says there's hope for the hopeless. God's not mad at you. It's funny, the marginalized and the ones who were the most screwed up in Jesus' day, they weren't afraid to go to him because he would make them feel bad. They were drawn to him like a magnet because they knew he'd give them hope. Let me close with this. March the 11th, 2005, you might remember the day. Brian Nichols was up on charges on trial for rape right here in Atlanta, Georgia. He was brought into the courthouse and he was able to overpower a deputy sheriff and he was able to get a gun. Every time I go to the courthouse now, I think about that day. I know you probably do too. He gets the deputy's gun, he shoots the deputy, shoots the judge, kills him, shoots a court reporter, kills him, shoots another deputy sheriff, shoots a federal agent. He kills 4 people in the courtroom and he escapes. Do you remember that? Massive manhunt. Everybody, it's like Atlanta's on lockdown because a federal judge has been shot. Can you believe that? And all these people shot, and he was in the courtroom and he had all these people. How did this happen? But it happened. National news. Everybody was looking for him. A few weeks earlier, in Duluth, Georgia, there was a woman named Ashley Smith, and her life was hopeless. Hopeless. She was a meth addict. She was so messed up, she had lost custody of her child. Her husband had been killed in a drug accident. She's a widow, a young widow, but she doesn't have custody of her children. She's lost the custody of her daughter. Her life's totally messed up. She has no hope. She finally decides that she needs to go to a church that has a Celebrate Recovery program, which is kind of the Christian AA, very similar to Christian AA. So she goes to that Celebrate Recovery program, but again, she is hopeless. She is hopeless. She is hopeless. A lady gives her this book, Purpose Driven Life, a book written by a pastor in California by the name of Rick Warren. She gave her this book. She walked outside, Ashley Smith, and she put it in the garbage can. The lady who gave it to her saw this, picked it up, and the next day gave it to her again and said, "You might want to read this." Ashley Smith began to read this book. And what she found in this book was page after page. It was a story of how much God loves us and how much hope He has for us and how He can give us hope. And it doesn't matter how screwed up you are, you can begin afresh. There's hope. And her life began to change. Let's go back to the day that Brian Nichols had his incident. Her life began to get better. She was feeling better about herself. It was late at night. She decided she needed to go buy a pack of cigarettes. She went to the store, and while there, her life intersected with Brian Nichols, who kidnapped her. He's hopeless. He's killed 4 people. Her life is just beginning to change. God is not mad at her. He loves her, and He's giving her hope. He takes her home, ties her up, puts her in the bathtub. But she begins to talk to him. And she says, "I know you think your life is all screwed up. I know you do. Mine was screwed up too. But I'm reading this book, and I'm finding out that God really has a plan, regardless of how bad we've ever been." And he says, "What book?" And she tells him. And he says, "Read it to me." And this former meth addict, no hope, who's just learning about hope, begins to read page after page to this killer. And you know the story. He turns himself in because he knows, as low as he is, as horrible as are the things he's done, there's hope. There's hope. The movie came out about this last month. I haven't seen it yet. It's called Captive. David Oyelowo. Do you know him? David Oyelowo. He is the one who starred as Martin Luther King Jr. in the movie Selma. He is a fabulous actor, and he is a fabulous Christian. He plays the role in this movie. They ask him, how could you do that? You play Martin Luther King Jr. and then you play this killer. You know what he said? He said, "I was drawn to King because he had hope. He was a man of hope." And he said, as any Christian, you would want to try to embody that. But he said, when I think of Brian Nichols and I think of a person who has absolutely no hope, who discovers that little hope in God, he said, I was drawn to that character as well. I don't know where you are today, but there's hope for you. Maybe your life is imploding even as I speak. There is hope. Would you bow your heads, please? Our Father, I thank you so much for hope, the hope that you give. That hope that is supernatural, not optimism, but a hope that says, you are God, you love us, you have a purpose and a plan, and you will accomplish what you say you're going to accomplish. We are moving in that direction. You are pulling us there. That hope that steadies us in a storm. That hope that prepares us for the unknown. That hope that swells up inside of us. It says, you are not through with us. We maybe have taken some wrong steps, but you have a purpose and a plan. Father, I pray today people who need hope would find hope in you. And I pray today those of us who have hope would become radar for people who are hopeless. And we would extend hope to them. If Ashley Smith could do it just a few days sober, help us be wonderful carriers of hope. With your heads bowed, I just want to ask you something. You know, I said it's that making a choice to follow Christ. And it is. And then it begins to grow in you. But right now, I want to ask you, have you made that step? It's a private thing. I'm not going to embarrass anybody. I just want you to know, have you done that? It's important to say, you know, I want to follow Christ. I want to follow him. I don't have it all figured out. None of us do. But I want to follow him. And then I'm trusting he will teach me each day what it means to have hope. So right now, if that's where you are, I just want you to pray this simple prayer. This is how I prayed it. You changed the words. I'm just telling you how I prayed. I said, Lord, I want to follow you. I don't know what that means exactly, but I do believe you're the one I want to follow. I want to learn to love you. I want to learn to hear your voice. I want what matters to you to matter to me. Y'all, when I prayed that prayer, it was a wonderful first step. But it didn't end there. Because then every day, I began to learn more about what it means to follow Christ. If you've prayed that prayer, I hope at the end of the service you'll come up and you'll tell me, hey, Ray, I prayed that prayer today. You know, you could be 90 years old, you could be 9 years old, doesn't matter. It's a great first step to make, to pray that prayer, to follow the God of hope. It's a beautiful thing.